everybody. Well, another day, another chapter. We're still, in general, a bit behind schedule, but we'll get caught up for the semester, don't we? We're just a little behind. Any general questions on anything before I just start talking about the next chapter? Well, all right. Still talking about agriculture, kind of expanding the range of topics in this chapter. I'm going to show you some agriculture examples. So I was flying into Costa Rica, and I don't know if you could make out, got a zoomed in picture. I would say a pretty common sight to see when flying over the tropics is that slash and burn agriculture that we've talked about. Historically done in a somewhat sustainable way, but in modern days, usually just turned into permanent agriculture, right? Doesn't kind of come back, doesn't sustain itself. As I was flying over, I've mentioned before about how in general in the tropics, the soils are of low quality because you get so much rain, it leaches out the nutrients. Also, the soil tends to be quite red, so when they're putting in a new road, you could usually tell overhead because it's pretty bright reddish. And that's just because, well, all that rain, as I said, minute particles of iron, of metal, that is just like in soil, rust, you know? So like, if you've ever dropped a magnet in the dirt and then you pick it up and some of the dirt is sticking to it because it's magnetized, there's small particles of iron and all kinds of different things in, soil and dirt, kind of depending on where you are and where you go. Costa Rica very rapidly developing to the point that they're getting a lot of sprawl, a lot of construction on areas that are very low elevation, which make it more vulnerable to storms and climate change, but people got to live somewhere, right? And as places develop, people want to, move away from central cities very often. Just a little bit more sprawl examples. Sprawl there, similar to here, usually it's cheaper to develop what we call a greenfield development, an open field. It's if you're a developer, you want to put in a suburb, just like an open field is a lot easier than going to a place that maybe within the city that has like maybe some old industrial use or something, because you'd have to kind of clean up that site. You got to kind of demolish what's there, basically scoop everything out, and so you've made all those expenses before you've even started building, right? These are topics we'll cover a bit more in the next couple of chapters, but since I was in this region, I thought I would just show you some examples. When I was in Costa Rica, it was the dry season, and so although as you can see, some of the irrigation is still going, a lot of it, many of the fields are just kind of left to sit for a while during the dry season. Countries with dry seasons, that dry season could be like half a year, it could be more, could be less, kind of depends on the place. These are just central pivot irrigation. You basically just have like a big apparatus and it spins around and it irrigates the area in that circle. Like I said, it was the dry season, so a lot of the crops were not doing super great even with irrigation. This is one of the crops that's talked about a bit in our chapter. I don't know if people recognize what kind of crop this is. Have you ever seen this grown anywhere? Can you tell? If I said it's in Costa Rica, would that help you guess? Slightly closer? No guesses? Pineapples. People often picture pineapples like on an apple tree or something, and it's like, no, they grow just the pineapple itself, and that's about it. Another crop in the tropics, and this is another crop that's specifically talked about in this chapter. Can we want to make a guess what it is? In the tropics?
Bananas.
There we go, that's a guess. Yeah, bananas. Well, you can kind of see them in this picture. The blue covering, the purpose of that is usually when they're growing these, they like to have them grown in bunches of 3. And so you usually have like one that's sprouting, one that's been chopped, and one that's ready for harvest. That way you could kind of keep it going. But, well, in nature, before this became intensive cultivation, you wouldn't have it growing like that, right? You need to specifically have some inputs to get it this productive, right? You need some fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, things that cost a good deal of money. But the actual money being made by people who are harvesting the bananas is pretty low. They put the blue on it basically when they're ready to harvest. People go through and check them and make sure, and then someone comes through and they grab those ones and they put them on this little conveyor. I don't know if you can see the person in the front. And then they just pull them around to a place for putting in boxes, basically, a huge crop, not just in Costa Rica, but much of this region, Central America, going into South America a bit. But if you go to places where these are, the banana plantations just go on and on and on, just like huge amounts. This section of the book talks about, well, as I said, talks about bananas and talks about exports and talks about, if you remember, we're already talking about how geography matters when it comes to trade. Usually perishable goods, you want to have your source be as close to the market as possible. And so that is why, well, Japan would not get their bananas from Central America. Now, of course, in our day and age, we have quicker transportation and we have refrigerated transportation. So we have things that have increased the range, and so these products are actually more competitive with each other than they used to be. But there's also a case of a lot of trade is often through past colonial networks that were set up during the colonial era, and they basically have often kept those ties even if, well, the colonization went really badly and there's a lot of animosity, but the trade networks are still in place. So in this chapter is talking about agriculture, talks a fair amount about the economics of agriculture. Already talked about, well, how you want to have your consumers next to where you're going to have your growers, or at least as much as possible, especially if it's perishable. Other things like, well, I think they're harvesting wheat here. That can be stored much longer period of time, and so the range of people who compete with each other for that is much larger, and that usually pushes down the price of it. And well, prices going down mean that people who are doing it, they want to do it cheaper, right? And usually that means, well, investing in technology, so you take less people, because that's kind of a major cost of agriculture is paying people, like many other fields. So through time, it's larger farms that have been able to invest in that technology, who have been more productive and have made more money, and smaller farms, unfortunately, in that competition, have been decreasing through time. And this was the thing that happened basically in more developed countries first, but now the rest of the world is going through the same thing, where agribusiness is kind of taken over the small family farms. We talked about a number of these things when we talked about the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution being new varieties of not just plants but also animals that are basically, in a nutshell, more hardy. Yeah?
Is this chapter 12?
Let me go back. Is it 13?
Or 13?
Oh yeah, 13.
Okay.
Yeah, 12 was last time. Oh, no, I'm skipping too far ahead. Economic forces that come into play when it comes to these foods and whatnot. Similar to other goods and services, governments can put restrictions on imports, on exports, especially in regard to trade wars that happen quite a bit. Sometimes you'll have an industry, might be agriculture, who will be popular with voters, right? And in general, usually if voters are voting for someone who's kind of pro small family farm, they'll get that vote. But often the policies that are put into place benefit all agriculture, and so it still benefits larger businesses compared to smaller ones. This chapter goes through a number of different kind of case studies looking at things, and I thought I would show local examples of these things. This chapter talks about the milk industry and the dairy industry in the U.S. The dairy industry used to be a big industry in Minnesota here, and we still have some. So you can see this in 1900. We used to 1920 even. But I would say our main competition was with Wisconsin. I mentioned this a little bit last time, but I didn't have these maps to kind of show you. And the reason why? Well, simply because Wisconsin is slightly closer to Chicago and the eastern seaboard where there's a greater population. So they're able to get to those people a bit quicker. But as you can see, although Wisconsin had been beating us for quite a while, California came into play, right? Time-space compression, which we've talked about before, increases of shipping technology, making it cheaper to ship things refrigerated, made it so that through time, California suddenly, although very far away geographically, especially in the old days, but through time, they've been able to compete more and more with us. And so Wisconsin is even not at where they were before when it comes to the dairy industry. They're still better and do more than us, but they're also a bit on the decline. In no small part because also California's agribusiness is in general kind of bigger. And of course, as we mentioned before, the bigger companies, they can invest more in new technologies, new productivities, new varieties to see what customers would rather kind of have. California just kind of being a very high-tech place in lots of ways. Just a reminder of the Van Thunen model that we covered briefly in the last chapter, but it comes up again in this chapter. Why is this never down low enough? Okay. There we go. Always chopping off the bottom. In a nutshell, what this means is, well, things that are more perishable tend to be closer to the population centers. Things that are less perishable can be further out. Not going to be reflection. Family versus corporate control. The thing that's been happening, well, happened first, like I said, in the U.S. and in Europe, more developed countries, but now these things are happening everywhere where more and more costs because you need more higher and higher tech, and we also have people, in general, the younger population in rural areas are moving to the cities, and it's their parents who stay on the farms, and so you have an aging farming population. And when I talk about high-tech inputs, it's interesting because I was Googling around about how AI is used in the farming industry, and I was actually pretty surprised that they're developing, they have lots of drones that shoot lasers at weeds, and this has become a new way of weeding, is using AI. I guess kind of, they're like little Terminators, but against weeds for now. We'll see how that technology goes. The other interesting thing farmers are doing with AI, I was looking it up and it was kind of interesting in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like phones, right? Your own personal little handheld computer. People are able to basically take a picture of what they're farming and have the AI diagnose if there's anything going on with the nutrients, if there's any kind of disease, and it can give you just kind of like all this information, and that is in fact already being used to increase productivity in farming around the world, which, like I said, I was pretty surprised about. Vertical integration, when a company controls more than one stage of the production process. That's a way to cut costs, right? Because otherwise, if you're not in charge of the different stages of the production process, if something goes wrong in a stage before or even after, well, that could really hurt your bottom line. If you're in control of all those stages, you can coordinate better. But again, that takes larger companies to be able to do that successfully, again, edging out the small family farms. Again, some Minnesota statistics. Average size of farm. So you can see the sizes are going up. What it says, part-time farmed and part-time owned. What does that mean? Increasingly, people who, if they're a farmer, increasingly they have to work multiple farms to be able to pay their bills, especially if they're small family farms. Also not shown in this statistics is, well, very often they'll have to get completely different jobs as well, and then their farm is turning more into a hobby farm that probably, when they retire, they'll probably sell off to a large agribusiness. When I say probably, that's the process that's been going on. As you can see, for many years, the average age of Minnesota farmers, similar to, well, every place else in the world is doing basically a copy of what happened in the US and in more developed countries, where the farming population is getting older and older. As I mentioned, percentage of farmers who have to get other jobs to pay ends meet, right? And it's one of those things where it's like, well, farming is a pretty full-time job as it is, and so, well, these are a population who are working all day and all night and still barely getting by. And so you can see why the younger generation is not doing it, right? They're like, well, I'm gonna move to the city, get a city job. I won't have to be working around the clock and to be barely kind of scraping by. This pattern, well, I already kind of talked about how in general, more developed countries, they're further ahead in this process, and less developed countries, they're a bit further behind in the process. This process is still happening where in less developed countries, you still have the farming population is getting older, the younger population's moving to the city wanting to do different types of work. And there's a consolidation of those small farms into large farms happening. But they're just different areas of the process, right? But it's very much seems like that's the worldwide momentum now. I'm not going to have you do this working with data activity, just because their graphs are not well done. Their graphs are not well done. Like if you're going to have little things next to each other, you would have them different, having them be identical, but then you type in little different numbers. I feel like they phoned it in as far as making the little graph. When I talked about that it's if you have control of your commodity chain, you can make things cheaper. You could also ensure that there isn't a disruption in any kind of level of that process. I would say in general during the pandemic, you've probably read a lot about supply chains, commodity chains being interrupted. And that's part of the reason why costs went up for a good while. It's because if you have any part of this that gets interrupted, and as agriculture became more and more of an international market, so that you would have multiple countries at play, different countries would have different amounts of close downs, different countries would have different amounts that they would have people kind of stay home, try to work from home, things like that, and that all basically just kind of interrupted everything compared to how it had been before. What happened is a lot of places have pivoted to be less globalized and more things local, that they could have control over the entire process. In some ways, since the pandemic, things have been going back a bit to the way it was, but very often they're not quite going back to the way they were, just because if they figured out a workaround that is still working well for them, they don't want to kind of recalibrate everything. farm subsidies, farms tariffs. Well, I mentioned how sometimes there could be subsidies because, the government will want to support farms. Sometimes those laws are put out to specifically protect family farms, but very often just farming in general, like I said. But there's other things that happen too. So, for example, in world trade, there's something called dumping, right? And so if another country, for example, well, let's just say Brazil and soybeans, just because that's an example this chapter talks about. If the government in Brazil decides to give large subsidies to soybeans and the price goes down a lot, other countries would see that as dumping, right? It's like you're not selling that for the actual price it costs because you're just trying to put our producers out of business by making it so cheap, and then once ours are out of business, then you just put the price back up and you have the market cornered, right? That's just a typical thing, not just in agriculture, but all globalized businesses. They're always worried because every different country usually has different types of trade negotiated deals and whatnot. Subsidies, but also tariffs, right? And so you could have in your country, well, just to stick on the topic of soy, the United States consumes more than Brazil, right? And so it would, as far as deciding if you want to do subsidies or tariffs, if we put up tariffs to soy sold by Brazil, well, then that would target them specifically. Whereas Brazil, compared to the U.S., does not consume as much soy. It produces it for export. Some people do locally eat soy products, but less in general. This chapter talks a bit about this trade war that happened with the U.S. and Brazil. And you can kind of see it on this chart here where, well, basically, you would have Brazil and the U.S., right? And Brazil, the U.S. accused them of dumping. They decreased their price. So what the U.S. did was they subsidized the soy producers in the U.S. so they could compete. Prices going down, but then you see prices going up and down and up and down because each country would keep on kind of maneuvering and doing different things. And these things, well, through time they led to overall lower prices, but this was through, as we say, complex kind of government mechanisms rather than just the market kind of deciding. And there's many arguments to be made for intervening in markets if another country is just dumping products and they're going to send you out of business. But usually these types of trade wars do not end up benefiting consumers that much. Like I said, I dug out my Minnesota maps today. Looking at different crops through time, wheat, well, as you can see, it's was a popular crop in Minnesota through time. But what happened, well, just like the Fertile Crescent, so we should know this type of thing would happen. It exhausted the soils, and so that's why you see the geography of wheat use. Started one area, exhausted soils. They moved over, exhausted those soils. Moved over, exhausted those soils, and then they just moved to other states. A lot of the wheat farmers, right? So it was a very it was not a sustainable crop if that's all you're growing, right? And so eventually those wheat farmers, well, they moved east and they went into the arid and semi-arid west, and then that is where basically the Dust Bowl happened because those soils were exhausted and then there was no other place to move to. What farmers had to do is they had to figure out how to make it sustainable. Part of the reason they never bothered to mix crops is because per unit, per acreage that you have, wheat was making you the most money, right? And so farmers were just like, this is making me the most money, I'm just gonna plant my crops, and if it exhausts the soils, I'll just move on, because at the time also, land was pretty cheap. Often land was given away to people who had some type of military experience. You can get, in Minnesota, plenty of people who fought in the Civil War. They were paid off and given farmland, right? And so it cost nothing. Sometimes they would farm it. Very often they would just like, I could just sell it for a couple bucks, make some money. But it made the land passing through hands very rapid. As you can see, through time, it exhausted those soils, and so production went up and then down. The other thing that benefited us locally here when we talk about different levels of your commodity chain, well, not only did we have the farms, but we had the central cities and we had great big mills, right? And so we could process that grain into flour. That also made it an advantage to locate here. Right, as you can see, there's lots of mills. The term grist mill just means milled anything, right? And so different types of things that are milled, but it was mostly products that were milled into flour, right? You can see central cities were kind of the main hub. Currently, wheat is more harvested in, well, areas that have a bit more soil productivity, but also they've started to rotate it, right? And as you can see, corn has become through time a big locally grown product. And why? Well, similar to when our chapter talks about technologies and how technology changes things, the technology to mechanically harvest corn came about, and then new strains of corn. Because as you recall, I mean, corn isn't from this far north. It's not a crop that actually grows that well this far north. Corn is originally from Mesoamerica. It's a hot weather crop that needs lots of water. Well, we do have lots of water in the state, so that's part of the reason. Plus, these more hardy varieties, right? And so this is kind of like a mini green revolution, or it's an aspect of the green revolution that happened before. As you can see, wheat then declined. Also, with the rise of corn, we had locally the decline of hay and oats, mostly because, well, we stopped using horses for everything. And so then all of a sudden, hay and oats, you need a lot less of it if you don't have horses carrying everything around. So less horses. But they are still growing more than zero. They're used in rotations. They're used in rotations rather than, so what that means is if you have to rotate your crops anyway, because you're going to otherwise exhaust your soils, those crops that you're rotating, they may not even be that economically advantageous to you, but you keep it in rotation so that you could have your corn growing as much as you want it to grow. Sugar beets, something that Minnesota diversified into. Bringing us up to the same old debate with soybeans. Soybeans, again, was a crop that at first did not grow that well so far north, but there was so much demand for it. This is before today we're able to just genetically engineer and whatnot, but at this point, we had to pick crops, and you would have to still do a seasonal by seasonal hybrids. Less high tech, but we're still able to make them more hardy, more able to be stored. Corn as well, new technologies so that we could harvest, but also store these things without them going bad. Because historically, we just didn't have the technology. But now, not only that, they could be stored for long periods of time, and we have more refrigeration too, so these things can be shipped around the world, whereas it used to be, these would have to be consumed pretty quickly and pretty close to where they came from. So our globalized world has really kind of made it so that more places are competing with each other than they used to. That's why Brazil was brought up in this chapter as a big competitor for soybeans. So you can see soybeans more in the southern half of the state, mostly because that doesn't get that much more sun, but gets enough more sun. Also, the new dynamic with corn, especially recently, has been that we've been starting to turn it into ethanol. The only problem with that is the process of making ethanol from corn uses resources, and so it's a bit expensive. And so, well, we've subsidized the production of ethanol so that it's cheaper and affordable. But what that also does is that subsidizes the growth of corn. So neighboring countries have argued that that's an unfair subsidy, and it makes it so it's more difficult for them to compete with our prices. Our argument, well, is basically that no, it's not a corn subsidy, it's an ethanol subsidy. It's to make ethanol cheaper. And it's like, well, but you get your ethanol from your corn, so, and that creates a demand for it, right? This is how these kind of international things, when they're arguing about and having trade wars, things get really complicated pretty fast because a lot of these products, including corn, are used for all kinds of different things, right? I would say it was also the same time period that we started making everything out of corn syrup, right? And then corn syrup kind of got some bad press and got a bad name, and then lots of things turned into using palm oil, right? And I showed you that short documentary about palm oil. That is in itself causing problems, but they're in countries that are far away, so they're often just kind of off people's radar. Unique market we have in Minnesota, turkeys, if you didn't know. But it's not because they're close to the market that they're consumed by. The only reason we've been able to be successful in turkeys compared to other countries is, well, people in our state figured out how to market them, right? There was a time if you wanted to have some turkey, you would just go to the store and you would just pick a turkey. Our state was able to add names to them, so it's like, you know, a butterball turkey. It's like, is that better than other turkeys? I don't know, but I remember the name. Name recognition is enough sometimes to edge out competitors. This chapter talks about, well, it brings up the Van Thunen model, which is still a useful model, but this chapter also points out that it's becoming less and less relevant because shipping is becoming cheaper and cheaper, and as I said, refrigerated shipping is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So these things that used to be very local markets, and that they would all be very focused on the Twin Cities where the population was for these products, and then that expanded out through time with the railroad and stuff, that it was like, okay, neighboring states are competing with each other. Now we have much of the world is competing with each other, except for, I would say, things like very fresh vegetables. Those still tend to be somewhat closer. You don't get a lot of those. Or dairy, you don't get those from other countries, unless you have a very small country. So some things are still relevant to the geography. World agricultural trade growth, as you can see, well, it's grown a lot. It'd be interesting to get this updated for post-pandemic, but this is all the data they got. Agricultural interdependence. As I mentioned, there's still large international commodity chains for lots of the agriculture that is produced and that is consumed. This chart here, leading exporters up here, leading importers down here. Well, as you can see, there's some crops that we're importers of and exporters of. Right, leading importers. You would think that we would have plenty of beef locally, but Americans have a larger beef consumption habit than we even grow. So we import these different things. I would say also in general, the previous chapter talked about this quite a bit, but you have a lot of people who were subsistence farmers who had small farms and they were growing for their local community. They have through time been largely changing to cash crops where you just want to maximize how much you're growing and you want to grow something that is on the international market in high demand, and you're not even looking at your local population. And so what does that mean and do? Very often that means that you could have a local population that is cut off from food, right? if you have, let's say you have a smaller country, right, and you have a population center, and you have a lot of agriculture all around, and they would grow like a range of things that people would consume. If they all turn into banana plantations, completely surrounding you for miles and miles, well, then even your simplest types of crops you want to get, you got to import from other countries, and you don't locally have anything besides bananas, right? And you can't live off bananas. One of the other costs that come about in agriculture, like all businesses, you need infrastructure. Well, when I say you have competing countries who are putting in infrastructure that are making things cheaper for you personally as a producer. Well, if a country that is competing with you has made it so that it's easier for them to produce a product that you also grow and sell, then you're under pressure to also do that same thing, right? They're all in competition, and those things cost a lot of money that individual farmers often, they don't have the money to put in extra roads and things, right? So what happens is your governments get involved, and your governments put in this infrastructure, and well, who wins in that fight? Whatever country is already more wealthy will just be able to afford to put in more, and they'll become even more competitive, right? And so a lot of developing countries feel a bit stuck because they can never quite be as competitive, even in something like agriculture that is a pretty basic commodity. International experts often say, well, if you're a developing country, well, it depends on the expert. Many are suggesting that these countries go back to working on supplying food for their own populations and have more of a diverse range of stuff that they grow, so that they aren't competing with the world. But what happens is, unless they put up trade tariffs and whatnot, wealthier countries will just dump cheap agriculture, and that will run local farmers out of business. And so that pushes local farmers to then, well, we need to grow whatever we'll get the most money for on the international market. And the IMF and the World Bank, for example, organizations we'll actually talk about more in the last few chapters, but they deal in international trade, and they basically tell every place to only focus on exports. Don't worry about your local populations, they'll take care of themselves. That doesn't always happen though. So these are the conflicts that just kind of come about. Also, like I said, there's a lot of these colonial relationships between trading partners and supply chains, but very often you could have unrest in a country that's part of your commodity chain, and that product is cut off if there's a civil war, right? Well, Ukraine being in the news a lot right now, they're still having a lot of trouble to get their grain shipments out, and much of the world is fed by them. And there was a real worry when Russia first did the big, I should say, secondary invasion of Ukraine, because they actually first invaded in 2014. But the more recent invasion, well, there was a lot of worry that much of the Middle East get their flour and grain from Ukraine, and so there's an actual real worry that could be mass starvation if that was totally cut off. They've been able to get enough out, and local producers have actually stepped up their game. So in some ways, this has actually been good for local farmers, even if they're less productive. They still are creating food that people can eat. As I mentioned with the turkey example in Minnesota, that's turned into a lot of people's diet, and lots of what people consume have turned into like preferences and name brands. People increasingly are looking for fair trade goods, right? There's a section in this chapter that talks about coffee specifically, because in that commodity chain, the people who are some of the main producers and pickers for coffee were making less and less money to the point that they were destitute. And this became kind of international news for a while, and a lot of people were then said, well, if your coffee just cost a couple cents more, it would mean that they could have a livable wage. A lot of places and people decided, okay. let's just pay a little bit more, right? And I would say that's kind of a trend that's been happening more and more, especially with the younger generation, is they'll look up where their products are from and who's getting rich off the products they're buying, and they're making consumer choices rather than purely, do I want this thing or that thing, which is cheaper. They're looking at, well, where do these come from? What kind of, are there abuses of their employees? Like, what's going on? This is becoming more and more part of our consumer market. People are suddenly being interested in this type of stuff, whereas previously, I think people would be overwhelmed because you go to the grocery store, you want to pick out something. It's like, how conceivable is it to try to figure out the whole commodity chain for all the things that went into, a Twinkie, right? It's like, where'd all the stuff come from? What is it? I don't know. Whereas, we live in the information age. A lot of this stuff can be figured out now. People can just go online and find the commodity chain and people have made viral videos about visiting people who grow chocolates, right? Grow chocolate in Central Africa who've never had a chocolate bar, right? And people have gone to these communities with cameras because cameras are everywhere, and they're like, let's just give some people some chocolate bars and see what they think. And they're mostly very surprised because it's so sweet, because chocolate in its raw form is extremely bitter. I don't know if you've ever, maybe as a kid, there's some cooking cocoa, and you've been like, oh, this would be some good chocolate, and it's like terribly bitter. That's because, we dump a ton of sugar in it. A lot of our chocolate craving is a sugar craving. Oh, actually, is that it? All right. Go back. I never really do the discussion activities that they suggest, so I'm gonna give it a shot this time. We'll see how it goes. I usually make up my own questions as you know, but let's see how these questions go. Get some small groups. Yeah. All right, look at the cards